and welcome to Writers in Conversation. This is a reading series that is sponsored by the English department at the University of Southampton in England. I'm Carole Burns, head of creative writing for the department, and the host of this series. And I'm really pleased to be saying hello to the readers and writers and students of writing who are watching us today. So it's a special Writers in Conversation tonight, in part because it's our first one that's online, a move prompted by COVID, but which I hope means that we're able to reach out to people across the UK and across the pond too. This is also part of the university's Black History Month, and I want to thank the public engagement team at the university for sponsoring our event. So I am missing seeing you all in person tonight, chatting before and after our talk, but there is a plus side to moving online, and that is we get to invite authors such as Donna Hemans to join us. She's in Washington, D.C., or just outside it, and she otherwise wouldn't be able to come all the way to Southampton. As many of you will know by now, Donna is a Jamaican American writer who is here to talk to us about her second novel, Tea by the Sea. This story about a young woman whose infant is stolen from her at birth by the father, who then mysteriously disappears, has already won many accolades, was featured as a book not to miss by the New York Post, Ms. Magazine, and Lit Hub, a very divergent set of publications indeed. What I like about this book, or one of the things I like about it, is the combination of emotion that she teases out through these vivid worlds of Jamaica and Brooklyn, combined with this intelligent, somewhat omniscient narrator. I think that's an unusual combination in today's literary landscape. But enough from me. Time to hear from Donna. Thank you so much, Donna, for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Not necessarily in person, but it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to do this event from DC at the University of Southampton, which, as you said, probably wouldn't have happened, in other times. So.
Great. So Donna is going to start us off by reading from the opening of Tea by the Sea.
Yes. So the first chapter is told in two parts. One, you hear from Lenworth, the father, and you also hear from Plum, the mother of the child. So I am going to start reading from the first part of it, which is Lenworth's section, and then I'll read Plum's section. Lenworth was back on the main road to Anchovy proper, past the long hill's deep ravines and its corners and its peaks, and long past the canopy of trees that shaded the steep road snaking up from the coast. He was on foot this time, with the baby in the crook of one arm and an oversized bag that he pulled with the other hand. Having mistaken one house on a hill for the one he sought, he was lost, and the driver who had taken him there had already left. On that stretch of road, without the towering trees, the sun's heat was like a glove on his body, too close and too heavy, and the sweat dribbling along his spine and in every crevice more of an annoyance than a cooling mechanism. He worried about the baby and the heat, whether she was too young to be so exposed to the elements. Still, he kept her covered under a thin blanket. Thin socks covered her toes. The car ride had lulled her to sleep, and she slept as if she had already grown accustomed to the sounds around her. A cow mooing in the distance, a dog's disinterested bark followed by the growl of another, a couple of goat kids neighing nearby, and honks from a vehicle that navigated the hilly road's deep corners. Since she was quiet, Lenworth suspected she was comfortable, and he willed her to remain that way, at least until he got to the house which he imagined couldn't be too far away. The road had widened and flattened, and to his left were the abandoned railway tracks. That was his mistake. Having sat for 2 hours already in the car, he had simply wanted to be at the house on the hill, and had forgotten the written instructions to turn left at the junction where the tracks crossed the main road directly in front of the secondary school with the blue and white walls. Now, he watched for the point where the tracks began curving toward the main road and an unpaved road to the left of the railroad crossing. He watched for the vehicles approaching from behind and passing on his right, turning to face the road each time a vehicle approached. He was careful not to brush up against the hip-high fever grass with its long, sharp blades, or the patches of cowish that would surely leave temporary welts on any exposed skin. Had it been another time, he would have pulled a handful of the stringy love bush and twirled the thin yellow strands of the parasitic vine around his fingers. He loved the rubbery feel of it, how easily it snapped apart in his hands. Yet it was sturdy and resilient, able to regenerate itself from just a small piece. The ground was hot, so heated the asphalt had softened and bubbled in places. The ordinariness of it all, the late summer afternoon's heat softened the asphalt, the sounds of natural life itself persevering, comforted him. He needed the comfort, for there was nothing ordinary or comforting about what had led him to that road that day. But he wouldn't think about that. Not then, not there. At last, he saw the point at which the railroad tracks crossed the main road. He saw the school, children in uniform, the open field next to the school. Further up that unpaved road and not before, the nurse's house with the scrolled iron gate, and finally the overgrown yard behind a cut stone wall. At the gate were two letters, an M and an O, the only remnants of the name someone had once given the property. Upon the hill was the abandoned house, a small and compact building that looked like it grew out of the side of the cliff. There was nothing elegant about the house. Two concrete columns that were once painted white held up a small veranda and framed a door to a cellar. To the right of the columns, a set of concrete steps rose up to the red floor of the veranda and the aqua railing that hemmed it in. The back of the house jutted out of the hillside, or so it seemed. The kitchen and dining room backed up to a small cliff, with only a sliver of space between the walls and in which the ferns and moss grew. The rooms, three if he counted only the distinct ones, or four if he counted the space in the middle with a curtain for a wall, were small, but the house would do. And despite the duck ants that formed black nests along the walls, the rotting floorboards he would have to replace, and the temperamental plumbing and electrical work, the house would be his refuge. So I'm going to skip forward a couple pages to Plum's section, and this is where she first returns to the house where Lenworth and she had been living, and this is the house that Lenworth has already left with the child. Indeed, Plum looked for Lenworth. She returned to their small cottage on property that at one time had been a large pimento and cattle estate. The pimento and the cattle were long gone, the surrounding land subdivided and developed as residential plots. All that was left of the estate were the cottage and the larger house, which from the outside looked like it would crumble without much prompting from a single puff of wind, then decay. But it was only an illusion. Inside was an artist's dream. Every inch of wood on the floor and the ceiling had been replaced and hand sanded and hand carved mahogany. The plaster walls had been rebuilt with new concrete walls, which were painted a light cocoa, orange, and green. The paint brushed on to make the walls look as distressed and as the outer perimeter of the house. Necessary modern conveniences were interspersed with remnants from another time, enamel bowls, yabbas, and shutters that banged in the breeze. On her return, Plum passed the main house with its front walkway flanked by two large monkey jars, flowering bougainvillea and hibiscus, and dwarfed by the flame of the forest trees behind it, both in full bloom. The flowering plants, with their red and pink and yellow blooms celebrating life, taunted and teased, made tears Plum Flood's eyes again. She walked past the house to the cottage in the back and found the rooms had been stripped of Lenworth's things, his CDs and books and papers and clothes. He didn't have much, but everything belonging to him was gone. Plum's clothes hanging in the wardrobe were meager, forlorn, and childish, a reminder that she had only just begun her adult life. Plum ran back out, tottered really, and found her landlady, Mrs. Murray, the artist who had given new life to the decrepit and rundown historic house. Look at you, Mrs. Murray said. She held out her hands, palms upward and fingers flayed, surprise and joy in her voice. Have you seen him? Plum asked. Lenworth? No. He's gone. What you mean gone? The levity in Mrs. Murray's voice was absent now. She looked over Plum with one sweeping glance, capturing Plum's heavy breasts and swollen belly, and the distraught look on her face. She caught Plum before she fell, held her up, linked their arms, and walked her back to the cottage. Inside the cottage, Plum lay on the floor and bawled, rocking and heaving on the ground like a Pentecostal possessed by the Holy Spirit, throwing off the landlady attempting to hold and calm her. When she had no tears or sobs left to pour out, and no strength to stand up, she knelt and looked around at the borrowed furniture that came with the cottage, then stood and looked around again for something of Lenworth's, a handwritten explanation, a clue to where he had gone and why. But she found nothing, no sign that he had lived there at all. Had it not been for her breast, achingly full, it would have all felt like a miserable dream, a nightmare that Plum wasn't actually living, and from which she would wake at any minute. Neither had words for what had happened. Lenworth was gone, and so was her child, the daughter she had planned to name Marissa. They let the silence cease. For Plum, the quiet was less painful than the sound of life, the twitter and buzz of birds and bees, the swish of leaves, the wind in the trees, a donkey braying in the distance. Mrs. Morris's lone parrot, which had escaped its cage again, cawed incessantly, taunting them from a guava tree. I hate that bird. Plum did the only thing she could in that moment. She stepped outside, picked up a small stone, and threw it at the parrot, forgetting that its wings had been clipped to prevent it from flying away. And I'll stop there.
Well, I'm going to clap for the entire audience. Thank you very much. That's a beautiful opening. I'm so glad that you read from it. So one of the things, and there's a lot I love about the opening. And one is how evocative it is of place, of course. But then it also strikes me that it follows that scriptwriter's rule of starting the beginning, starting a story as late as possible. And I'm wondering, is this where you actually started the story when you were writing? And or you know, how did you come up with starting with this particular moment, not any earlier, not any later?
Well, initially when I started writing, what I had an idea to write a story about a woman who, or a group of people who are in a church. And so the section that the very first part that I started writing was of a mother who was at home, and it's there in the latter part of the book, in the fourth section, where Plum is at home and she is getting her daughters ready to take them to school. And she drops the children off at school. She's getting ready herself to then go off to work. And she starts going down the subway stairs. And instead of actually getting on the train, she turns around and leaves and goes to the church. And so that's where the story began for me. And for the longest while, I thought that that was where the book began. Drop her right in the moment. We know she is searching for something. And this is the start of her search. So my first draft began there with the story when the child, and that is actually the daughter's birthday. So the story began on the birthday, the 17th birthday of Opal. So, you know, I had that draft, I think, for, you know, first draft, second draft, still with that beginning. And later on, in the process of writing and revising and listening to other people talking about what was missing from the story, I, realized that the story needed to begin somewhere else. So I had to shift and change and began it actually 17 years early. So I went from trying to tell a story over a 24-hour period to telling a story that takes place over 17 years. And that's it's such a dramatic shift.
It's interesting though, because the sections that the book is told in, they're not 24 hours, but they do kind of enable you to break up the 17 years into smaller segments and more manageable segments as well. So that was a great crack to sit in as well, Donna.
Thank you. It worked out.
So I also love how you evoke place. Why do you suppose writers so often write about where they're from, even when, or especially when, maybe, they don't live there anymore?
I think it's largely perspective. Because I think when you're in the midst of something, and if you imagine when you're in the midst of a breakup, like for that first, 24 hours, 36 hours, even the first week or month, it feels like that's the only thing that you're living. You're not able to look at and to see exactly why that relationship fell apart. You aren't able to see what is, like the truth about that person and why that person and that relationship wasn't necessarily good for you. And I think it's the same thing with place, that, when you're living in a place, you are seeing it for what it is. But when you are, whether it's a few years out or some months out and you're away from it, you're then able to see it for what it is. And I think you can see the people, you can see the characteristics of that place, or whether it's a small town or, an entire country. I think you can see much more when you have that distance of time and that, that physical distance away from a particular place. So I think that as writers, we need perspective in order to be able to write about something honestly. When you're in the midst of something, you're probably only seeing the good. You're not able to see the multidimensional aspects of a place because you're living it day to day. But when you step back, you can see so much more.
I think sometimes you see the positives as well. Things that drove you nuts when you're in a place, you realize are,
True.
so yeah. But you're kind of yearning in a place that a writer no longer lives in.
Right. Yeah, it's more than just the yearning. You're seeing every aspect of it. You see the good, you see the bad. You probably put so much more in context, in a historical context or in a social context, that you don't necessarily know when you're in the midst of it. And for instance, I don't write about Maryland. I don't really write stories set in DC, and it probably will be another maybe 20, 30 years. I don't know. And I've moved on somewhere else before I will have the perspective to write about, DC in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I've written about DC. When I was still living in DC, I had a story set in a particular spot there. But otherwise, I ended up writing about Connecticut, which is where I grew up.
Right.
Much less exotic than Jamaica, from my perspective, at least. I want to emphasize to our somewhat invisible audience members that we really would love to hear questions from you, especially our students, for whom we do this. So do stop being shy now. You're online. You just have to type a question. So, screw up that courage and send one in. So this is a Black History Month event.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask you, how did you, as a writer of literary fiction, think about the huge backdrop of history as you go about writing this, much smaller story of two individuals? Is history something that you want to take stock of in some way, or is it too overwhelming to think about too directly?
No, I think that most writers, I think in some ways you can't necessarily divorce yourself from history. And it is present in our lives and in our work in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's not. And I think with this particular book, I wanted to look at, I was looking at and concerned with this whole idea of agency. And agency is tied directly to to our history. I mean, Jamaican history or history of colonialism. And if you look at, colonialism as this umbrella that still, even though Jamaica has been independent since 1962, I think colonialism is still as an umbrella that just sits over our lives. When you go back and you look at the way in which colonialism worked, I mean, one of the primary problems is that, you have a group of people coming into another country, taking over a culture and a people, and erasing that culture and that people's, that people's culture, their way of life, and making all the decisions for those groups of people. And it's something very similar that happens here, that, Lenworth steps in and he makes a decision, a momentous decision that affects Plum's life and it affects Opal's life. And he doesn't give her an opportunity to weigh in or to, she has no say in his decision at all. She just suffers the consequences. And so I think when you put those two things side by side, that in some ways, Lenworth's actions and the lack of agency that Plum has is some ways, there's some parallels to, like our colonial history and the story of, colonized nations across the world. So I think that as writers, while, there might be these bits and pieces of history within our stories themselves that as we're writing, we're not necessarily overly conscious of it. Because I think when you're too conscious of like all of those elements, they weigh your story in a way that you don't necessarily want it to be weighed down. You want to be focused on the people themselves, the plot itself, the world of that book that you're building. But at the back of your mind, I think for every writer, there are these other ideas that either show up, during the revision process or during the writing process, and you make some effort to bring those things to the forefront, but they're not necessarily what is driving the story from the process.
Yeah, yeah. I think we might have some questions. Am I right? Yes, we're going to get a swish of a question from Abby. What made you want to get into creative writing? When did you first realize you wanted to be a writer?
I think back in undergrad, I mean, I'd always written. I think either, like as a, in high school, I had written stories and all of that. And I had this grand idea that I wanted to become a lawyer and I was going to represent all the underrepresented people in the world. And, so I went into undergrad thinking that I would major in English because that would be a good foundation for a law career. And very early on realized that there was no way I was going to stand in court and defend the people who probably, there's some people I just simply wouldn't defend. And I started working on the school newspaper and I took a creative writing class. And I liked that class, like the fiction writing workshop that, I was in, like what I was writing. And I knew in some ways that once I finished with undergrad, the only other degree that I wanted to get was an MFA. So not very long after one of my first jobs was working in journalism, writing related, of course, but not the creative aspect of writing that I wanted. And then I started writing a story, which was the opening of River Woman, my first novel. And I realized that I needed to write that book. I wanted to write that book, and I didn't necessarily know how to do it. So I applied for a creative writing program and then went on and worked on that book. So it's, a lot of that, my writing just, it grew in some ways, but I don't know that I had a single moment, that hit me on the head.
Yeah, yeah. And River Woman is a beautiful novel too. And in the chat, we're going to be sure to put Donna's website up. And there are links to where you can buy her books in America. And they're available in the States too. And I know our wonderful independent local October Books will be having your book when it's out officially in the UK in December. So from Laura, how did you find planning your story? And how was the editing process? Did you make any drastic changes? I'm sure Laura must have put that question before you answered the part about the beginning, but there might have been other drastic changes you made as well.
Yeah, well, there was one other drastic change. I think when I first started writing it, I wanted it to be I wanted to tell Opal's story as well. So it would have been Lenworth's story, Plum's story, and the child's story, Opal. And I think in the editing process, I realized that, there were some sections that I had that I thought were, well written and they were beautiful and I loved it, but nothing was actually happening. So Opal was not, as an individual character on her own, she was not necessarily as fleshed out as I wanted her to be. And so she, just spent the entire time just thinking, but never doing anything. And, so it's one of those things that I realized I had to take her out of it and make it, just simply focus on it as a parent story. And really, that truly is what it was. And I think once I took her out and made that change, it was just a much smoother story than what I had been trying to do. So I think those were the two major changes, getting rid of Opal and changing the timeline. And the timeline alone was the most significant change because it really required me to think about the story in a very different way. In the very first version, because it was set over 24 hours, I had a lot of flashbacks. So I was trying to tell the story of 17 years, but the story just kept looping back and back and back. And so there was just simply, there wasn't enough forward momentum. So right. So it was a significant change, a meaningful, significant change. And I am glad I made that change because it makes the story much better.
Yeah. What about sentence by sentence? How do you do? I'm trying to remember. I met Donna at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and I can't remember now if you are one of these people that writes each sentence perfectly first, but very slowly, or it's like a scribble and then you go back and edit it. How about like paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence? How do you do that?
I think I'm one of those slower writers. I go back and forth over sentence, over paragraph, jump back and forth in the story. I might write one paragraph here, jump to something else in the end, write something else there, and go back and forth. So I'm never writing straight. And I am not one of those writers who can just simply sit down and pour everything out and then figure out how to make the story work. Usually when I sit down, I don't necessarily know where the story is going. So it takes some time to really think it through and understand how each change I make, whether it's something that a character is doing, a place where the character is going, really does build this plot and build the story as it moves forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I like editing as I write. I know there are some people who just think that that's the worst thing you could ever do, but that's the way in which I figure out the story.
Yeah. Another question, Tilly. With the amount of drafts that go into novel writing, how do you know when the story is done? Or is there always that instant to tweak that and shift this?
Well, I'm sure if I really spend some time looking at this book, there's some things I'm going to think about wanting to change.
Don't do it.
No, I like to think when a story is done, it's done. But generally, I ask myself a question, or I generally, when I'm thinking about a book, or there is a question that I want to answer. And in this case, the question was, how far will a mother go to find her child? And usually, I think by the time I have answered that question, then I know that the story itself, that I have told the story. There's a lot more work that I have to go back and do to make sure that everything that I have put down lines up with that particular version of the story that is in my head. But I think that usually is how I know that I have written the book, or I have told the story. The plot is finished. Have I answered that question? And how did I go about answering that question is the next part of it, because then I have to go back and make sure that everything is lined up to get us towards that answer. Do I have stuff in there that is kind of extraneous, that really veers away from the question that I was asking? And is it important to the story? Do I need to take that out? So it's, but I think a lot of it really is just simply driven by that question in my head of whatever it is that I want to answer or I want to explore in that particular book.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we have more questions. From Alice. Do you have anything you wish someone had told you when you first started writing? In other words, Alice is wondering, whatever it was, tell me.
I think there's just so many things. But one thing that I kind of wish I had known is that the process is going to be different for every single book. Whatever worked for the first one is not necessarily going to work for the second or the third. And I'm not just talking about where you write or how you write, but even just how you get the story, how you build upon what you have. It's something that I learned. My first novel came out in 2002. My second one in 2020?
Yeah.
That's a significant time between books. But in between those two books, there are two other books that I started working on. And I've written several drafts of these two books, but didn't quite get to the point where I truly believed that I had told the stories that I wanted to tell. And so I set them aside, and I ended up writing Tea by the Sea. And in some ways, when I wrote Tea by the Sea, one of the things that I learned, and one of the reasons I think I finished that book, is that I was focused on the story. Whereas what I realized was that I was so focused on the structure of the other two books that I was bogged down by the structure and not able to really get at the heart of the story. And I'm not sure that anybody could have told me that, but I think just now being aware of the fact that each book will be different and that I will come at each book in a very different way really just released a bit of tension that I wasn't doing what I should have been doing. So that's one. And I think the second thing is that there's no timetable. I think that there's a lot of expectation, especially if they're young writers. You have one book, there's a lot of expectation that the second one should be coming, and you'll hear from so many people, your agent, your editors, your friends, your family members. What are you doing? Where's the book? What are you working on? When is it coming out? But there's no timetable. It's the book itself or the story you're working on will tell you when it's done. And you really have to figure out how to manage the people and the expectations that you do something.
Yeah, that's great. My niece was about 7 years old, and she would come and say, "Carole, are you done your book yet? Are you done your book yet?" And then she'd go off and write a book in like 5 minutes and come back. "Look, I've done my book."
Yeah.
Pressure from the 7-year-old. Anyways, I saw a question there from Joe. Joe, listening. What advice would you give to people who are struggling for inspiration? Do you advise people to stick with what we know or take on a challenge?
Well, I'll take the first part first. In terms of inspiration, I like to think that we can get inspiration from something other than writing. I think, like certainly every writer should be reading and reading a lot. And one of the things that I find is that when I'm reading, I am writing better. I'm writing more. So that's one thing. Read. If you're uninspired or if you're stuck in something, just pick up a book and read. It could be a book you like. It could be a book you hate. But I think in one way or another, you'll find something. And maybe you'll be motivated by the fact that you absolutely hate the book that you're reading because you know you can do better. Or you might be inspired by, the beauty of the language, the plot, the storyline. There's so much within any book that you pick up that could inspire you. So that's one. But I also think that what helps is just doing something else that's totally unrelated to writing. Maybe you like to draw. Maybe you have never drawn anything. You've never picked up a pen. But I think using another part of your creative brain, I think sometimes helps you to get back to what it is that you're missing or what it is that you want to do, but you're just not able to get at. That's the first part. And I mean, the second part of your question, I mean, challenges are always good, but I think that, I mean, there's so much talk these days about, like who should be writing what and who is allowed to write what. What should I write? Do you write outside of your culture? Do you write outside of your race? What really are you allowed to write? And so I think when I think of it in that term, in those terms, I think that the question that you should be asking yourself is not whether or not you should only be writing what you know, but why are you choosing to write whatever story it is that you're going to tell? What are you bringing to it that is going to be a bit different from what somebody else would be bringing to that story? And I don't know if it's necessarily a question too of, is it my story to write? But it's more of a question of, if I am writing this story, am I going to do a good job of representing this idea and this group or this, whatever it is, this thing that I don't necessarily know about? So, I mean, I think challenges are good because if you write what you know, for most of us, we would be writing a very, very, very narrow, writing within a very narrow window. And for some of us, we would also be taking on a lot of risk in order to find something, to experience something to write about. And I don't know that you necessarily have to or want to do that, but I think the risk is in your imagination. Taking the challenge, taking the risks in what you imagine in how you build upon something. What else can you learn about that you can truly and honestly write about or write about in a good way? But I would say it's, write what you're passionate about, write about what you're passionate about, and write about something that really moves you. And I think if you're moved by it, then your readers will be moved by it as well.
Great, thank you. Another one from Abby. Is there any significance in the names you choose for your characters? That's a great question because I was wondering about Plum.
I don't even remember how I came to Plum. I had her skin is dark. I mean, she is described as a very dark-skinned woman, and her what's his name, Lenworth, is a little bit lighter than she is. So I think when I chose her name, I wanted to play on her physical characteristics. But outside of that, I just thought it was a beautiful name, and I liked it. Lenworth, I initially had him, he was originally called Louis, Lewis, and I have an uncle named Louis, Louis, and I didn't want a similarity in the name, so I switched. But so yeah, in this case, I don't think the names, there wasn't much significance in the names themselves, except for Opal. Opal, I believe Lenworth chose her name because of the color of her eyes and the way, when she looked up at him as a baby. So there is something within their physical characteristics, or at least those two, that is tied to their names. But outside of that, these were just names that I liked. They worked.
Great, thank you. I like Plum. She seems like this seems like a good name for her.
Yeah. And I didn't, there are times when you change a character's name, and hers was one that, it just worked for me from the very beginning, and I never changed it.
Great. I think we have more questions. Is creative writing your main career?
Let's see. How do I answer that best? I want it to be, but no. I've had, I guess, various versions of my career to date. I started out as a business journalist. I did that for a number of years. And then I worked in corporate communications for a while, doing speech writing and other, writing other corporate materials. And so I did that. Yeah, I did that for about 10 years. And then last year, I decided to do more freelance writing and concentrate more on fiction. So the third thing that I do now is that I run an organization, it's called the DC Writers Room. And it's a writing studio, a co-working studio for writers. And it's based here in DC. So if you look at that as it's a part of my writing world. So yes, I kind of want to think that, creative writing in some ways, I mean, writing is the focus of my life, has been the focus of my entire career. But I don't know that I would really realistically be able to say that creative writing is the primary thing that I do, or any writer will be able to say that. I certainly want creative writing, or the fiction portion of my life, to be the center of my life, and to have everything else work around it. And that's the way that I think I've structured my life now.
Yeah, it's a vocation, perhaps. It's the word career makes it seem like, that's how we all earn our money, and it's that's rare for writers. But vocation, I mean, it is what you shape your life around. So
right.
I think I'm going to say yes to that question, actually.
Okay. Yes. It is. It is. But yeah, I think I really like to think of it as, vocation works. So I'll go with that.
Next question. Eli, hello. How do you find the revision editing process? And what tips would you give someone? Yes, we've had a feeling it was you who struggles with it.
It's revision. I don't know. It's a hard thing to say any one thing about revision, and I think partly because for me, I I revise as I write. And so a lot of the revision process takes place for me during the writing of the book. When I'm done, usually I will have one or two people read that particular version. I'll take their feedback and I'll step back in and try to one, address those changes, but also look at it in terms of a broader look at it as a the broad picture of this book, not just the nitty-gritty details, but really what does it mean, what does it say. One of the things that I like to do when I'm early on in the process of writing is that I like to have a sentence written down about what the book is. That sentence, that's probably the answer to the question of what is it that I'm searching for, but also, and so I should say it's in addition to the question that I want to answer, but I also have just a single sentence that could be, in this case, it was a mother searches for her child who was taken from her at birth. That's the single sentence that describes the book for me. And when I have that sentence, I think I can truly, truly, truly approach the revision process because I know now what the story is about. And I can go back and look at each piece of the story to find out if they're hanging on to that thread. So I look at that, this line, whatever it is, runs through the story from beginning to end. And everything that I either add or take away during that revision process needs to be tied to that single sentence that's running through. I think that probably is the best thing that I think I can say about the revision process. I mean, and I think partly too because everything changes with each book. Like whatever it is that you thought worked to revise the first one probably won't work to revise the second one. I don't know if you have had that experience, Carole. It might be the same for you, but it changes. But I know that, like as writers, you have to embrace it. You have to accept that you're going to revise this book. And I think that even just having that open mindset is beginning with that mindset that it has to happen and you're going to do it is probably also just the best thing that you can do.
I guess I did find that my second novel, I felt there were things I learned about writing a novel in the first one that I didn't have to learn over again.
Okay.
The ways in which like the different pieces need to weave together, the strings need to kind of tie up, not too neatly, but how you can connect things a little bit more closely. So that I felt like that was true. But I suppose, Eli, I mean, revising is when it really gets better. And I would just think to try to be a little patient with yourself.
I mean, there's so many pieces of the revision process. In some cases, you're going back to make sure that the characters make sense, to look at how you describe the characters, to look at whether or not something that a character does really lines up with the personality you've given that character. So that's one aspect of it that might be an easy fix, or it could mean that you are then going to have to restructure some pieces of your story because what that person is doing doesn't fall in line with something else that you have said about that person somewhere else. It's also if setting is an important piece of your story, then one of the questions that you're asking is if let's say, for instance, you have set your book in Jamaica in September. Do you then have to think about the weather and what role does the weather play in the plot of the story? How does it impact your characters? I mean, there's so much more. There's such a wide range of things that you have to, begin thinking about in the revision process. And, once you get to that point, it's a combination of trying to figure out whether or not the plot you have laid out really works, but also whether everything else works in line with that plot. So it just feels to be just such a difficult thing to compress to, one or two easy things to say about it, except you have to embrace it.
It's a Rubik's Cube.
Right.
The whole cube is screwed up.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. And how did you get published? For the first time, let's say.
The first time so my first novel, River Woman, was my thesis, for the MFA program at American University. And so once I was done there and I had graduated, I spent some time reworking that novel itself, and I sent it out to a couple of agents, and I got an agent who liked it or who absolutely loved it and who was able to sell it. So that book was published through an imprint of Simon and Schuster. So my publication process is not one of those difficult stories or my first publication process is not one of those long drawn out and difficult stories that you often hear about. And it really comes from first finding an agent who loves your work and can support you and your career. At least here and in these modern times. I mean, that's the path that most writers take. I think with my second novel, things were a little bit different. Of course, it's 18 years between books. My previous agent, I had a separate agent who sold a second book. And that one, again, my agent sent it out to a couple of editors, to some editors. We got some feedback. I went back and did some revisions, and we sent it out again. And in the second round is when I found Red Hen Press, who loved it and wanted to publish it. So two different tracks, two different different years. The whole industry has changed, or certainly changed a lot, in that time. But two different approaches. So it's not necessarily the story that I've heard. I mean, I've heard so many other people with, years and years and years, and a number of books that they set aside or that they failed to sell. But my story, I guess, is just a little bit more straightforward than some of the others I've heard.
It is nice to hear a straightforward one for a change, actually.
It is.
Okay, I think we have more questions from Leah. Do you have information on your characters, things you could have written as part of their backstory, but you didn't include it because it would make the story too complex?
No, I don't.
I
don't. I have seen other writers who will sit down and write, very long descriptions about their characters, and they know every single thing about what that character or what that character does or would do in a different life or under certain different circumstances. And I don't. I mean, because I develop these people and their situations as I'm writing the book, and so like let's take Plum for example. I think at one point I had her working in doing a corporate job, and it didn't feel like that was her. It just wasn't working because I wasn't really showing her at work, but it just didn't fit the kind of storyline that I was telling for her. And so I went back, and I think it wasn't until I was in the revision process where I started looking at when I brought her back to Brooklyn. Because when I changed the storyline, I then had to add or the timeline, I should say, I had to add some more information. So when I brought Plum back to Brooklyn and I had her, there's a section that you will read early on where she goes to the Brooklyn Public Library and she starts looking through books and trying to figure out what kind of a career she would have. And she didn't want her mother's career. Her mother was a nurse, but she wanted something in the medical field, and she just simply chose to become a lab technologist. And I think that fits in terms of who she was, the kind of person that she had become, because she really didn't want to have to deal with people. And you're in a lab, you're dealing with specimens, you're not dealing with people, you're not hearing their problems, because she had her own problems. And so once I did that, and that worked better for her as a character, I think it just worked throughout the story. But I didn't necessarily have that in mind. I didn't have a long description of the types of things that she would have or would not have done. that, helped me to make that decision. It was just something that as I thought about it as I was working, it made sense.
But do you have scenes, like maybe from her childhood with her parents, that you wrote but then realized you didn't need, or things like that?
Not so much with Plum. The pieces that I wrote and realized I didn't need were with Opal. And those were the sections that I took out. And I tend to be the kind of writer who writes shorter rather than longer. And a lot of that, I think, stems from my journalism background. I worked for a wire service. And so, you're concentrating on getting information out as quickly as possible. You're competing with somebody else by, 1/10 of a second. It's not minutes, it's not days. And so I learned to write short, to get to the point and move on. And I think that has translated to my fiction writing, where most of the times I just simply begin a story. There is not a lot of that build up, not a lot of things that I end up having to cut. It's, I usually am looking at the document thinking, okay, well, how many more pages can I add? 150 pages. I've told the story. I have 150 pages. I need another 100. What can I add to this thing? So yeah, my problem is more of trying to add to things rather than substituting.
Interesting. I think we have more questions. Laura, how did you discipline yourself with writing? Did you find it easy to incorporate into your routine?
Well, when I was working, it was, I had to make the time. Let's put it that way. So one of the things that I did when I was writing Tea by the Sea was I woke up for some reason. My body, for some reason, was waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, or sometimes at 5, and I, would lie there for a while, waiting and waiting. Okay, when am I going to drift off to sleep again? And finally, I just gave up and I said, well, I'll go write. And I got up in the mornings and I worked on this book before I went off to work. And then somewhere in that timeline, I ended up working from home 2 days out of the week, which gave me a little bit longer time in the morning since I didn't have to deal with a commute to get to the office. But it required quite a bit of discipline to get up every morning, especially when it's really cold and you really do not want to get out of that bed, but to just simply get up and do it. But I think, and I think a part of it too was that the story was running through my head, and it was there. I needed to get it down on paper, because once I was done with the book, I went back to sleep and just perfectly fine. And it worked for that book. It got me up and got the book done. But I think that, one of the things that all of us, I think, really have to do as writers is to schedule time to write. To know that, you might have, like a 2-hour window, you might have a 4-hour window. What or how much can you do within that window of time? And we simply really have to schedule it. I know it's difficult, especially if you have a family, if you have children you have to take care of. But if we don't make that time, then it's not going to happen. I heard, there's a friend I was talking to who said that, one of the things that she did when she was working on her book was, if she knew she had 15 minutes, she would, like text a friend or email a friend. And, they had an agreement. So she just simply said, I'm going to write for this window of time. And the time would begin and her friend would keep her, in check and make sure that she actually spent that amount of time working. And at the end of it, she emailed or texted back to say, I am done. And so for her, just having that person, I don't want to say overseeing, but having, like somebody looking over her shoulder, so to speak, making sure that she used the time that she scheduled, it was helpful. So I think each of us can find some little way in which we can schedule the time or discipline ourselves in order to get something done.
So find a conscience if you can't find
a exactly. Find that's a good way to put it. Find somebody who will be your conscience. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Rebecca is one of our creative writing colleagues.
Okay.
So Rebecca, who are the writers that you love to read?
Well, I would say my favorite, of course, is Toni Marson. That is one of those books I come back to from time to time. One of those writers, I think I should say, I come back to from time to time. And
Your favorite book?
Beloved, I think, is my favorite. And for some reason, this week I decided I would reread Song of Solomon, and so I have just restarted that one this week. But outside of that, I mean, there are lots of books that I like and I love for various reasons. And this year, I will say, like one of my favorite books I read this year was a book, The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Dary. She's a British Nigerian writer. And it's a really beautiful book about a young girl who is married off very young and who wanted to have an education and who finds a way to make sure she finds her voice and figures out how to make sure she is able to get the education that she wanted to have. But one of the things that's really beautiful about the story is the way in which she, uses language. Because this girl does not speak in standard English. And yet, as you're reading it, you know exactly what she's saying. But it's a part of her education. It's a part of her growth. And I think it's a really beautiful book. So I would highly recommend that to anybody.
Great. Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we'll wait for one to appear. What would be your number one tip for someone like Meg who wants to become a writer?
Number one tip is to read. Just read and read and read. There's so many things that you will learn in a classroom, but there are also a lot of things that you learn when you're reading a book. And you're not even aware that you're learning it. You're just soaking up stuff just as you're going. You're figuring out and you're seeing how a writer puts a book together. You're seeing how a writer falls into dialogue or when that writer falls back out of it. You're seeing how a writer uses flashback and doesn't, falls into something in the past and figures out a way to get back out of it, back to the present moment. You're seeing how the writer builds the story from page one all the way to the end and how that writer hooks you. Because it might be emotion that hooks you. It might just simply be the energy. It might be the chase. It might be, there's so many bits and pieces. But I think that for you as somebody who wants to become a writer, I think you just simply need to read. You will soak up so much more. And once you sit down to write, you will be surprised at how much that knowledge, how much of that knowledge you've incorporated without necessarily knowing it.
Great. Well, Donna, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciated these questions. They are very, very good questions.
They're terrific, mostly from our students, I think. They're wonderful. So let me remind you all that we do this 3 times a semester, and this is just our first one. And so we're going to get a slide up now of our next 2 events, I think. So the first one is Stephen Thompson, who is a novelist and the writer of the acclaimed BBC TV drama Sitting in Limbo, which tells the story of his own brother's experience during the Windrush scandal. Stephen will join us on Monday, the 16th of November at 7:30 p.m. And then the following Saturday on the 22nd, we'll have best-selling author Tracy Chevalier. She's best known for A Girl with a Pearl Earring, and she'll be talking about her most recent novel, A Single Thread, which was just released as paperback this week. I was lucky enough to interview her last year walking around Winchester Cathedral for the Washington Post, and it's a fascinating book. It's also partly set in Southampton. So both of these events are online, and do join us for those. So thank you again to our wonderful students who asked terrific questions, to Sylvia Lanati and Dr. Aisha Yahan, who is herself a writer. They've been in the background forwarding the questions, making Donna and me go big, small, little, medium. And thank you to Rebecca Smith, my colleague in the audience. And Donna, just thanks again for joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. by the magic of the internet. It's a terrific book. I so loved hearing you read from it. And I hope to see all of you, including Donna, in November. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Bye all.